My guest today is Dr. Carla Fowler, an MD, PhD, and elite executive coach. For the last decade, she's been a secret weapon for scores of CEOs, entrepreneurs, and other senior leaders. Carla's unique approach combines the latest research from performance science with timeless best practices to help top performers level up and achieve their goals. In today's episode, she teaches you how you too can level up and be a top performer in your career. Welcome to Lifeology.
James, it's great to be here.
I am excited. We were talking in the pre-call. So today I'm going to go to the pool and you're going to go cross-country skiing. So it's great that in the United States, it's so diverse of the weather, but we still are going to get out and get that exercise that we all need. One thing I always like to ask my guests is how in the world did you become an elite top executive coach, an MD, PhD, all the things?
Well, it's funny. I think the best way to understand this, because a lot of people are like, that's a big pivot, mid-career, is just to say that I think from about the time I was in fourth or fifth grade, like that period of time, that awkward period of time as you're getting into middle school, that I think sometimes we have experiences and we're like, oh, okay, like you're branching out. The world is kind of a scary place. What is it that I'm going to do to cope with that? And for me, I think a big piece of it, like a little story would be, you get into middle school, it's a big new school, bunch of elementary schools coming together. And, within the first couple of weeks, your best friend has decided that actually they're kind of more interested in branching out and running around with some other kids. Yeah. I don't know if anyone in the audience can resonate with this, but, and you suddenly are like, man, this social stuff is a big deal. And also, how am I going to get along? And I think that's the earliest I can remember thinking, well, I think if I can figure out how to be good at stuff, if you can sort of think about that, that's in my sixth grade brain language, that at the very least, maybe people won't make fun of me as much. But that also there was this element of saying, and there are sort of social games to be played, that we are social creatures and we sort ourselves into groups, and that might be something to think really carefully about over the course of my life. And I think that's the root. And then of course we encounter things, we make decisions. I gravitated towards things I liked, like math and science. I was really interested in people, and so wanted to do something that really helped and engaged with them. Yeah. And so, of course, you make decisions along the way, knowing what you know. And that took me on this amazing wild path through kind of academic science and medicine. It also took me to crazy places on the sports field, and wow, to see what that was like. And ultimately brought me to this place where I was like, the common thread is I love high performance. I love thinking about it like a scientist. And I think this is a subject with enough depth that I could study it for a lifetime. So
wow,
that is sort of how I get to today.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was watching this show years ago called Through the Wormhole with Morgan Freeman, and I don't even know, it was on Discovery or something. And there was one episode that they were talking about the high performers and the visualization aspect. And so I don't remember how they measured it, but there was someone that was able to do to shoot an arrow or bow and arrow, and they were able to measure the brainwaves, et cetera, of how people who would visualize it and how they wouldn't visualize it, and the accuracy, et cetera. So they had all these different metrics of how to measure it. And it was so fascinating to me. And like I said, they had so many really cool episodes. I highly recommend that show if anyone has not seen it. But they specifically talked about the performance science of it. And it's neat because I don't think anyone really, maybe I'll speak for myself, I didn't realize there was a specific aspect of performance science that really conceptualizes and can really grasp all this to help people level up. So tell us more about that. What is performance science?
Yeah. So performance science, and you gave such a great example there, is I think of it as all of the ideas and the people studying and thinking about how we do our best work. And as you pointed out, sometimes that best work has a real physical component to it. So there was a lot of sort of sports psychology and also kind of sports physiology that I think is really the roots and the history of performance science. But it rapidly had utility in all these other fields that were more sort of thought performance, right? Like in business. And what I think is interesting is now I believe performance science is coming around to say, oh, wait, these areas that we thought were mostly about thought performance actually have a lot also to do with like physical performance. That if, for
Interesting.
example, as a CEO, if we're not like fully caring for our bodies, maybe getting like at least enough sleep,
Self-care.
you're probably not going to be the person getting the most sleep on the planet, but these things matter a lot. The physical actually matters to our thought performance. And so
Yeah.
I think it's this really interesting full circle that we've come around to.
In psychology, we teach that whatever you think about determines what you feel, creates your emotions. Emotions create your response. So that can either be through a chemical change, through hormones, that could be through a physical change as far as how you interact with somebody. So the linkage between our thoughts or our perception and then how that creates perhaps confidence, and the confidence can create a non-shaky hand if you're doing some type of sports itself. Can you walk us through the different aspects of how we can be aware of that for a layperson? So someone like me, well, I'm not a layperson, but anyone that's listening to my show right now, what are the ways in which we can all be very specific and intentional about our performance in anything we do?
This is such a complex question, and
I know, right?
I'm thinking about where's the most useful place to start.
That's funny.
One of the things that I really focus on as a coach, because as you said, our brains are a place where we can have some influence, but also this idea that we can fully control our thoughts or our feelings, I think isn't necessarily a realistic goal for us. And but one of the things that I have found is really very helpful, and so it's often where I start, is to think about helping people get clarity about a couple of big questions. And the reason I think about it is because we are encountering so much noise in our day to day. Like, we are very socially inclined, as my my story from sixth grade illustrates.
Junior high,
that we're very influenced by the people around us, by the media, by all these inputs we're getting. And so one of the places I like to start is really asking people, and this can be at a meta level, it can also be in a very specific situation, but this idea of, what is it you want to have happen? Like, what is it that you really want? And that can be results, that can be a dream you have, it can be about your career and where you want to go. It can be, what do you want your life to feel like? But I love to ask this question because I think that when we can get our brains to start to focus on that, then we also can then ask a secondary question to say, what's really most important for that? Like, what are really the big drivers? And this is a principle I talk about in performance. I call it brutal focus. But one of the really interesting pieces about it is that when we can actually do that, we can start to turn down the volume on the noise of saying, well, do I need to want what other people want? Am I being kind of overly influenced by how other people are doing things? Am I overly influenced by trying to do all the things and feeling super burnt out or just depleted, and also maybe not getting the satisfaction of sort of wanting something and then really going after it and seeing that I have the self-efficacy to accomplish that? And I like to get clarity on these things because, as you point out, like, sometimes we start with kind of our thoughts and our feelings, and those start to create signals throughout our bodies. But I've also found and that sometimes if we have some clarity about what might be helpful, even if we do not feel like doing it, even if it's not like a thought that's occurred to us, that when we start to change our behavior, sometimes we can actually start to influence what those thoughts and feelings are. So what I'm conveying is there can be a two-way relationship between these things. And so I find that clarity or that brutal focus is what helps us get to what are some behaviors that might actually help you feel differently, versus trying to sort through any number of things one could do and say, like, well, which ones?
That's funny. What I always tell people as well is when we're doing really well, create all these lists for self-soothing techniques, self-soothing behaviors. From an emotional standpoint, because if my mood goes up and down all the time, and when I'm down, I'm not going to have the mental fortitude to be like, well, what can I do to help myself? And so to have something already preemptively done, so therefore I can plug and play. I may not want to do this, but I know it's going to help me. So let me introduce this to myself to help reset the pendulum, to hopefully get myself back up. So from a psychological standpoint, that's what we do. But I mean, for you, I mean, I'm sure there's so many things that people can do to help them continually level up.
Well, I love that you brought that up. I have a different way I put words to it, which is this idea of what does it look like to create a good day? And what I mean by that is like, what are some of the actions? What are the things you're working towards that are compounding towards either those achievements or even just the pace and rhythm and cadence of life that tends to, even though, of course, we, like that is how we feel and life kind of goes up and down, that tend to keep us moving and with momentum in the direction we like. So this idea of, and so some of these things can be resets or soothing, but sometimes it's things like, so I'll give an example for myself. It might be, I know that, for example, if I can get myself in bed on time, that it is likely the next day will look better, even if today was kind of like, kind of crappy. And, or for example, I really like to exercise. So like getting some sweat on, just kind of moving my body, even if I'm so tired, I'm like, all I'm going to do is stretch. That tends to improve my mood. And even if it doesn't, so these components of like, what does building a good day look like, even if I don't feel like it, is that even if I still at the end of the day, I'm like, well, that was a crappy day. That often what happens is the next day, I look back at that day that didn't feel super great, but I don't look at it and say like, and now I feel bad on the next day because I wasted yesterday. Like I was feeling bad. And so I don't know, like I didn't do things and maybe I, just did some stuff that wasn't so great for me. So it has this added benefit of saying like, build that good day. And even if it doesn't turn around your mood, it's okay because in the future you'll look back and you will feel good about like how you handled that. And so
and how you work today.
That's one of the things I think about.
That sparked my mind just went blank here. I was so focused on this about the performance aspect of it. So if someone does that, they have that reset, so a 24-hour reset. But also, I think just even if you still do those things, for example, stretching, you're still implementing the structure that you've created for yourself. And I think structure is one thing that sometimes we forget, that this is what my structure is. And when I've worked with a lot of people who had a lot of mood dysregulation in my practice, and one thing we really focus on is how is James when things are going well for him? When things are going well, what's the attributes that he demonstrates? When things are starting to break down, what does that look like? Or then when things are breaking down, how does James present? And so that was something I would have, not for me, but my clients would do that for themselves. And then I would also say, well, have your friends and family, the people that are close to you, have them be able to give you those attributes as well. So therefore, not only do you have your subjective version, but you have the objective as well from other people being able to give that to you. It's a really good marker because if you know that things are breaking down because you haven't done your structure, then more than likely, that's the direction you're going in a downward spiral because your structure isn't there. So I think, based just a little bit that you're the expert here, but I hear that as creating structure, and however that may look for you, whether you feel like you can do it or not, but you do the activity or do follow through with the time frame or whatever that you put into your schedule. I would assume that would keep people focused regardless of how successful they felt that day was.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely it. And to be fair, like you're coming at this with a lot of expertise as well. And, and it's really fun to share ideas with you on this. One of the other things that's interesting about structure, and I do like to bring this up, is this idea of, can we both hold two ideas at once? One is that structure can be really helpful. So part of brutal focus is this idea of really having some clarity about what your priorities are, which is sort of related to then maybe making a structure that works really well for you. But the other piece is, of course, whenever we're trying to do something that is challenging for us personally, or maybe even challenging in an absolute sense, like, I don't know, you're trying to build a startup, like you are kind of walking into that uncertainty. So when we're doing these challenging things, another thing we have to sort of have in our toolkit is the ability to work through that uncertainty, and to actually know that like, ooh, plans, even my structure might need to change, might need to have some adaptability or some flexibility. Like, so I grew up in Seattle, and one of the interesting things, Seattle is kind of an earthquake prone place, is how they build the buildings in Seattle. So the key about, well, I think this is probably true across the states now, but you have to have some flexibility and actually ability for the building to move. And so I remember my father told me after one of the big earthquakes that his building, which was a skyscraper, basically swayed back and forth for about 5 minutes after the big earthquake. And I know, right? But it's this idea of holding simultaneously. How do you have both a good structure, but also understand that there will be moments when you can't run that as planned? This can be even just your weekly calendar to say, it's worth making a good plan. And the reason I say this is because when we put intention behind things, it is much more likely that A, those most important things happen, and B, that we actually feel a better sense of control, which is different from whether or not we actually have control. But we feel like we have more control when we sort of set an intention and then can deliver on it, much more so than the way we feel even as a high performer. If you were like, I'm just going to work as hard as I can today, you might get the same amount of work done, but when it doesn't have some intention behind it, I think we often feel like there's more chaos, and we often feel like, oh, I didn't get enough done, even though, you really worked hard. But of course, plans don't always go the way we think they will. And so another principle that I talk about is this idea of learning to relish some uncertainty. So that's definitely something we could explore.
Yeah, I want to hear more about that. That's interesting. Relish some uncertainty. Okay, tell me more.
Yeah, well, it's this idea that like sometimes we have things that we know enough or we're comfortable enough with that we're pretty sure we know how they're going to turn out. And that's because often they do turn out how we thought they were going to. Like when I set out to cook some eggs in the morning, like generally speaking, I managed to cook the eggs. But a lot of times when we start to feel discomfort, less confident, all of that, there is an element of uncertainty that's coming to play. And particularly as you take on more ambitious things. So but the thing is, our brains really love to avoid uncertainty. So sometimes that means we don't get started on something new. We sort of avoid it. We do a bunch of prep and we keep prepping, but we don't actually like.
Busy work, not execution. Or procrastination.
Yeah. I mean, the other thing we do sometimes is like, and I've seen this happen for various leaders where there's uncertainty and maybe things are going slower than they want and they just want to control it. And so like they don't like being in that uncertainty. So they try and control it. And sometimes that leads to them kind of micromanaging or mucking around with a team. And it just makes the cultural dynamic less good. And it's usually not actually helping.
No,
and
not
so,
at all. Yeah.
Yeah. So we have these responses to the discomfort of uncertainty. And so my thought or mindset on this one is that if we can start to see what's good about uncertainty and say, because one of the things that uncertainty does is it actually expands our world. It is a source of growth. It's a source of getting us off autopilot and actually having to engage, because moment to moment, we actually don't know what's going to happen. It's like, if you've seen the TV show before, like you can multitask and you don't really care about watching every minute. If you haven't seen the TV show before, you're like, wait, like, I'm paying attention. So, and I think the last thing about uncertainty is, where there is uncertainty, there is often also some opportunity. That in the places that are really well defined, really well known, there's often less opportunity. And that's why a startup often has like a high level of uncertainty, but also potentially like a really high payout. And so I love to talk about uncertainty and start to say like, but what does uncertainty do for us that's actually positive?
That's something where I I to sit with the uncertainty. One thing from a psychological approach
Yes.
is, or maybe a self-development approach, I look at that also as just to simply ask the question in the moment when you're uncertain, when you're feeling whatever, what am I learning about myself right now? And so when you can
Oh, I
ask
love
that
that.
key point, that key question, I've asked it so many times. And as I said earlier, I'm like, well, I'm learning patience right now, or I'm learning that I don't know what I'm doing right
Yes.
now, whatever it is. But when you can be specific and intentional about a lesson, that brings you into a place of being retrospective or introspective, rather, to say, this is what's happening. How am I showing up? What am I learning? What's really manifesting in my life? And now what do I do with it?
hmm Yeah. Well, and that being able to sit with it is such a wonderful piece of saying, and even just exploring the discomfort to say, like,
Mm-hmm.
am I physically uncomfortable? Like, another question I like to ask is, because our brains evolutionarily have a little bit of a negative bias, and
Mm-hmm.
that's because it was helpful to help us survive. It's always better to
Mm-hmm.
suspect something bad is going to happen and be super aware. Uh, it keeps you from getting eaten by a tiger or something like that.
I know, right?
But the challenge, of course, is what it means is when we encounter uncertainty, often our brain, our feeling, our physiology, the first instinct is that uncertainty equals risk. So if there's uncertainty, there's something negative at stake. And so one of the things as you're sitting with uncertainty is to really look at it and say, well, what is the full range of options? Because we often think just on that side below
Mm-hmm.
zero, and to say, what's actually possible on the positive side? What are all the things
Yeah.
that could be positive that comes out of this? And to help your brain not sort of automatically or even subconsciously just sit only with the uncertainty tends to equal, negative consequences,
Mm.
which is interesting. The other thing I love, and this is something a friend told me, it was advice they'd gotten, but was this idea of trusting your future self.
Oh, interesting. I like
And
that. I like that.
so even if it's just your future self of tomorrow, like you're like, oh, my boss called me and wants to meet tomorrow, did not say why,
Yeah.
and I'm kind of nervous about that. But it's this idea of saying, we often are worried about the uncertainty when we don't even have all the information to take some
Mm.
productive or proactive action about it. But that to sort of trust that when you have that information, as the cards get flipped over, metaphorically speaking, that your future self will be equipped to make good decisions and use the resources that are available in the best way you can. And of course, I'm not trying to say that this always equals a positive outcome, but the thought of often the likelihood of a catastrophic outcome is very, very
Mm-hmm.
low. And there's a bunch of
Yes.
things in between. And
Yes.
you can't start to make those decisions or perseverate about those decisions before you actually have some of that. And so I like this concept of can I give this over to my future self and just let my future self deal with it when they're equipped with what they need.
Yeah. To piggyback off that as well is I always tell people additionally is if whatever emotion I'm feeling right now, the situation may be different, but if I'm feeling uncertain or I'm feeling fear, if I can reflect back in my personal database, James, when did you feel fear before? Like I said, the situation may be different, but you felt fear before. What did you do that helped yourself through it? What did you do that did not help yourself through it? Because if you can implement that right now, what helped me, then I don't have to reinvent the wheel. I'm like, oh, I know I do this, and it's decreasing my fear. And then I can tackle whatever it is. And so I think it's great to trust your future self and also perhaps look at your past as for how did you deal with that emotional construct and put those two together. And then here we go. Here we are today.
I think this is, I'm imagining past self on one shoulder, future self on the other shoulder. This is a great combo we've put together here.
That's hysterical. Dr. Carla Fowler, it has been an absolute pleasure having you on my show today. We literally flew by. We could talk about this all day. If my viewers and listeners want to find out more information about you and to work with you and to learn all your techniques and principles, where would they find this information online?
So a great place to contact me is through my website, and that is at THAXA.com. That's THAXA. You can certainly learn more about my coaching, and you can also message me through the site if having a conversation to explore that makes sense to you. And if you actually just want to continually follow along with good ideas about performance science, I usually post things on LinkedIn at Carla-Fowler, so you can follow along there too.
Wonderful. My viewers and listeners also know that if I can't find this information any other place, simply go to the show notes at jamesmillerlifeology.com, and I'll have all of your information there. Thank you so much for being a wonderful guest on my show today.
Thank you.